I need a disclaimer for this chapter. I made a couple of mistakes that I really wish I could fix easily and republish the book, but it's it's a lot of work to fix, so I want to fix all the problems all at once and then try to republish eventually. I'm not sure when I'll have time to do so, but it'll happen eventually. But for the meantime, I said that the Essenes did not have this like central focus around, maybe not even central, just like a focus at all on prophecy. But if you read Josephus, he does clearly talk about that being something they're into. So I just wanted to make this disclaimer about that as far as this chapter goes. I thought I fixed it when I published because I knew this mistake was in here, but I don't know if this book is just so repetitive that the same information got repeated somewhere else, and I fixed that, but then left this, but you're stuck with it. So I'm just gonna say that, and we'll get on with this chapter. Part 2: Flaws in the Official Narrative. Everything up to this point has been introduction, necessary but not exactly exciting. This is where things start to matter. This is where the discussion moves out of the realm of general background and into actual argument. In the chapters that follow, I argue that the Dead Sea Scrolls are most plausibly situated in the time frame closer to AD 200. This conclusion arises not from a single line of evidence, but from a cumulative assessment of the data, where multiple lines of inquiry converge on the same general period. That said, this case is not without tension, the evidence does not fall neatly into place, and any claim that it does should be treated with caution. Certain data points resist a post AD 70 or even AD 200 framework altogether. Pursued along different lines, they could suggest a much later, even medieval origin, and in some instances raise the more unsettling possibility that the scrolls may not be ancient at all. I don't personally land in those camps. I don't think the evidence ultimately supports a medieval origin, and I'm not convinced the scrolls are outright modern forgeries. But I also don't think those possibilities are out of the realm of possibility. If we're going to challenge the standard narrative, we have to be willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it gets uncomfortable and when it complicates our own conclusions. So rather than pretending there's no tension in the data, this section is going to lean into it. We're going to look at the evidence that supports a later dating, but we're also going to acknowledge the pieces that don't fit neatly. The goal isn't to force a conclusion, it is to test one, because at the end of the day, the issue isn't just when the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, it's whether the story we've been told about them actually holds together under pressure, and that's what we're about to find out. So we'll get into chapter 7: Flaws in the Essene Narrative. The identification of the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Essenes has become one of the most entrenched assumptions in modern scholarship. This identification, often presented as a natural outcome of converging lines of evidence, archaeological remains at Qumran, paleographic and radiocarbon dating, and brief references to Essenes in ancient literature. Yet argument beneath these surface arguments lies a more fundamental and rarely scrutinized premise that the content of the Dead Sea Scrolls corresponds meaningful to Essenes as described by classical authors. Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, and Pliny the Elder are routinely invoked as providing an external literary profile of the Essenes, a profile that conform, scholars claim finds confirmation in the scrolls themselves. This appeal to ancient testimony functions as a contextual bridge between the text of the Essene hypothesis. Without this bridge, without without genuine content level arguments between the scrolls and these descriptions, the identification collapses regardless of archaeological proximity or assumed chronology. I'm going to challenge the legitimacy of that bridge. I argue that the alignment between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes of Josephus, Philo, and Pliny are not the result of clear correspondence, but of interpretive commendation. When the scrolls are read on their own terms and compared directly with the defining features emphasized by ancient observers, the two portraits diverge sharply. The divergence is not limited to minor differences in practice or emphasis, it extends to theology, authority, eschatology, self identity, and the community's understanding of its place in history. The Dead Sea Scrolls present a movement defined by revealed interpretation, sectarian exclusivity, apocalyptic expectation, and allegiance to uh, un, an, to an allegiance to an unequally authorized teacher figure. By contrast, the scenes described in classical sources appear as an ethical and philosophical Jewish movement, noted for discipline, piety, and communal virtue, rather than angelic revelation or historical self consciousness. These are not complementary descriptions of the same group viewed from different angles. They are structurally incompatible profiles. The persistence of the Essene hypothesis, therefore, cannot be explained by strong content level agreement. Instead, it rests on a pattern of methodological consensus. Silence is treated as support, contradictions are reframed as differences of emphasis, and distinctive features of the scrolls are either diluted or reassessed to hypothetical subgroups. Over time, this process has transformed a tentative identification into an assumed fact, shielding it from the kind of sustained internal comparison it has rarely received. The comparison undertaken in this chapter proceeds from the deliberately simple and transparent principle: content must match description. If the Dead Sea Scrolls generally represent the ideology, structure, and worldview of the Essenes described by ancient authors, then the defining characteristics emphasized by those authors should be clearly, consistently, and unmistakably present within the scrolls themselves. Identification cannot rest on inference alone, it must be grounded in demonstrable correspondence between internal textual claims and external historical descriptions. This principle is necessary because similarities is, in general, behavior or moral posture are insufficient to establish identity traits. Yeah, to establish to establish identity. Traits such as communal living, shared resources, esoteric discipline, and ethical rigor are not unique to the Essenes. They are basic traits that could be applicable to any number of 100 groups throughout time. I speculate, but I think it is reasonable to assume these traits appear across a wide spectrum of Jewish groups, philosophical schools of religious communities in the Second Temple and early Roman periods. To argue that such features alone is to mistake common cultural patterns for distinctive markers. Accordingly, this study does not ask whether the Dead Sea Scrolls share any points of contact with the scene descriptions. Some degree of overlap would be expected even between unrelated movements operating within the same religious and cultural environment. The relevant question is whether the scrolls reflect the same movement, that is, whether the core theological commitments, sources of authority, self understanding, and historical outlook found in the text correspond to Essenes as they are portrayed by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny. This approach also requires that silence and emphasis be taken seriously. When ancient observers repeatedly highlight certain features of a group, such as ethical philosophy, communal discipline, or social reputation, those features should occupy a central place in any authentic textual corpus produced by that group. Conversely, when the scrolls devote sustained attention to themes that are absent from external descriptions, such absence must be treated as evidence rather than dismissed as accidental or insignificant. Finally, this methodology resists harmonization by hypothesis. It does not assume lost sources, unrecorded subgroups, or internal diversity unless such claims are explicitly supported by the evidence. The burden of proof lies with the identification itself. If the scrolls require extensive qualification, reinterpretation, or compartment compartmentalization. I'm really tired. I didn't sleep last night. In order to resemble the Essenes of antiquity, then the identification is not being conformed, it is being preserved. The task, therefore, is not to assemble a plausible synthesis, but to test the claim by placing the internal content of the Dead Sea Scrolls alongside the external descriptions of the Essenes without smoothing contradictions or privileging traditions. Josephus presents the Essenes as one of the three principal Jewish philosophies alongside the Pharisees and Sadducees. His treatment of the Essenes is extensive and deliberate, appearing across multiple works: War, Antiquities, and Life of Josephus, and offering a coherent portrait of their beliefs, practices, and social organization. Crucially, Josephus does not describe the Essenes as an obscure or marginal sect. He portrays them as a recognizable and widely distributed movement within Jewish society, known primarily for its disciplined way of life, rather than for esoteric theology, revelatory authority, or prophetic speculation. The defining features Josephus emphasizes are practical and ethical in character. He highlights their rigor, moral discipline, devotion to virtue, and commitment to self-control, communal ownership of property, and shared labor form the let's reread that. Communal ownership of property and shared labor form the economic basis of Essene life, reflecting an ideal of equality and mutual responsibility. Josephus presents these practices not as mechanisms of sectarian separation, but as expressions of philosophical restraint and ethical consistency within the broader Jewish world. The sectarian literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls frames communal life very differently. In these texts, community membership is tied not merely to ethical commitment, but to participation in a divinely revealed order of truth. The scrolls repeatedly stress submission to a revealed covenant and obedience to the interpretations of the law that are presented as uniquely authoritative. Communal discipline is thus grounded in theological claims rather than philosophical ideals, and membership carries implications of access to truth not shared by those outside the group. Josephus also presents the Essenes as deeply loyal to the law of Moses, yet without portraying them as speculative interpreters of Scripture. Their piety is enacted through obedience, custom, and ethical conduct, but through claims of hidden revelation or inspired exegesis, he does not associate them by he does not associate them with the belief that Scripture conceals a cryptic historical program decipherable only by the initiated elite. By contrast, the Dead Sea Scrolls define the community through revelatory interpretation of Scripture. The Habakkuk Pesher explicitly claims that the true meaning of the prophets was disclosed to a singular authoritative figure. In 1 Q Habakkuk, uh, chapter 7, verse 4 through 5, God made, I quote, God made known to the teacher of righteousness all the mysteries of the worlds of his servants, the prophets, end quote. In this framework, Scripture is not merely to be obeyed, but decoded, and its true meaning is mediated through a revelatory teacher whose insight distinguishes the community from all others. Josephus's account of Essene worldview is equally restrained. He does not describe them as an apocalyptic movement awaiting imminent cosmic upheaval. His focus remains on daily discipline, moral formation, and philosophical endurance. The Essenes, as he presents them, are concerned with cultivating virtue within the present order rather than preparing for an imminent end of history. The scrolls, however, are structured around an explicitly apocalyptic horizon. The War Scroll situates the community the parameter within a predetermined cosmic conflict between the opposing spiritual forces. In 1QM, chapter 13, verse 10 through 12, quote, in accordance with your truth, you appointed the Prince of Light from of old to assist us, for in his there's a blank here are all the sons of righteousness, and all spirits of truth are in his dominion. You yourself made Belial for the pit, an angel of malevolence. His dominion is in darkness, and his counsel is to condemn and convict. All the spirits of his lot, the angels of destruction, walk in accord with the rule of darkness, for it is their only desire. End quote. This worldview casts history as divinely scripted struggle in which the community plays a central eschatological role, an outlook entirely absent from Josephus's description. Josephus also emphasizes that the Essenes were geographically dispersed, living in towns and villages throughout Judea, rather than withdrawing into a single isolated enclave. Their way of life was visible and integrated, not centered on retreat from society. The Dead Sea Scrolls, by contrast, reflect a community that defines itself through separation, opposition, and internal discipline, frequently framing outsiders as participants in error or corruption. What is most striking, however, is that Josephus does not include What is most striking, however, is what Josephus does not include. Despite his interest in origins, beliefs, and defining traits of the Jewish sect, he makes no mention of central revelatory teacher guiding the Essenes or founding their movement. There is no persecuted leader endowed with exclusive divine insight, no claim that revelation has been withdrawn from the broader Jewish people, and no suggestion that Scripture functions as a coded chronicle of contemporary history. These omissions are not incidental, they concern precisely the features that dominate the sectarian texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where Josephus describes a movement characterized by ethical philosophy, social discipline, and lawful observance within a society. The scrolls depict a community defined by revelation, apocalyptic expectation, and polemical reinterpretation of Scripture. The contrast is not one of emphasis but of central structure. Josephus' Essenes are a recognizable Jewish philosophy operating openly within the social order. The community reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls under the, bleh. The community reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls understands itself as the exclusive bearer of divine truth, engaged in an eschatological struggle against rival groups. If Josephus is accurately describing the Essenes of his time, then the movement represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls cannot be identified with them without fundamentally redefining one or both beyond recognition. The features the figure known as the teacher of righteousness stands at the very center of the sectarian literature found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. He is not a peripheral authority or symbolic exemplar, but the interpretive and theological axis around which the community identity is organized. The scrolls consistently present him as the uniquely authorized interpreter of Scripture, the individual through whom divine insight into the law and the unfolding of history has been revealed. According to the sectarian texts, the teacher is portrayed as a persecuted figure opposed by the corrupt priesthood and rejected by the dominant religious authorities of his time. His conflict with these authorities is not merely personal or political, it is theological and covenantal. The scrolls depict the existing priestly establishment as fundamentally illegitimate, while the teacher is presented as divinely appointed, restorer of true understanding and faithful observance. Through him, the community claims access to the correct interpretation of the law and the hidden meaning of the prophets. Crucially, the teacher of righteousness is also associated with revealed knowledge concerning the end times. The community understands its own historical moment through interpretations attributed to his insight, viewing contemporary events as fulfillments of scriptural prophecy disclosed to him alone. This gives the teacher a role that is simultaneously exegetical, prophetic, and foundational. The identity of the community is inseparable from his authority and legacy. It is precisely here that the Essenes' identification encounters a decisive obstacle. Josephus, whose accounts of the Jewish sects are detailed and systematic, never mentions such a figure in connection with the Essenes. This science is not marginal or accidental. Josephus devotes considerable attention to the customs, beliefs, origins, and distinguishing features of the Essenes, yet nowhere does he allude to a founding teacher, revelatory leader, or persecuted figure around whom the movement coheres. A community organized around a singular divinely inspired teacher, especially one in conflict with the Jerusalem priesthood, would not escape the notice of an author explicitly concerned with the cataloging Jewish philosophies and their defining traits. Josephus names leaders when they matter, traces origins when they are relevant, and does not hesitate to discuss figures associated with sectarian innovation or controversy. The complete absence of the teacher of righteousness from the Essene descriptions cannot plausibly be attributed to ignorance, oversight, or brevity. This absence represents more than a missing detail. It signals a fundamental mismatch. The Essenes of Josephus are defined by shared discipline, ethical practices, not by allegiance to a singular revelatory authority. By contrast, the Dead Sea Scrolls describe a movement whose identity, theology, and historical self-understanding are inseparable from the teacher of righteousness. If the scrolls accurately reflect a community centered on such a figure, then the community cannot be straightforwardly identified with the Essenes as Josephus describes them. Philo of Alexandria Philo of Alexandria offers a portrait of the Essenes that is distinct in tone and emphasis from that of Josephus, yet consistent with its essential respects. Writing from a philosophical and diasporic, I can't breathe. Writing from a philosophical Jewish perspective, Philo presents the Essenes as contemplative moral philosophers whose way of life embodies reason, virtue, inner discipline, and spiritual tranquility. His interest lies not in sectarian controversy or historical conflict, but in the Essenes as exemplars of ethical and intellectual refinement within Judaism. Central to Philo's description is the Essenes' approach to Scripture. He emphasizes their use of allegorical interpretation through which the law is read as a source of moral and philosophical insight rather than as a cryptic record of hidden historical events. Scripture functions as a guide to the formation of the soul, not as a coded blueprint to imminent eschatological conflicts. Philo's Essenes seek wisdom and self-mastery, cultivating restraint, humanity, and harmony as expressions of a life ordered by reason. Equally important is Philo's insistence on the Essenes' withdrawal from political entanglement and sectarian hostility. He portrays them as deliberately distancing themselves from the rivalries and conflicts that characterize public religious life. Their separation is ethical and philosophical rather than polemical. Far from defining themselves against enemies or corrupt authorities, Philo's Essenes aim at peace, communal concord, and freedom from disruptive passions. This portrait stands in stark contrast to the worldview articulated in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The sectarian texts are saturated with apocalyptic expectation, envisioning history as an imminent and divinely orchestrated confrontation between opposing cosmic forces. The War Scroll presents violent eschatological not as metaphor or distant hope, but as central to anticipated reality, as we previously read in 1QM 13:10 through 12. Quote, "In accordance with your truth, you appointed the Prince of Light from of old to assist us, for in his there the blank are all the sons of righteousness, and all the spirits of truth are in his dominion. You yourself made Belial for the pit, an angel of malevolence. His dominion is in darkness, and his counsel is to condemn and convict all the spirits of his lot. The angels of destruction walk in accord with the rule of darkness, for it is in their only desire." End quote. History in this framework is not a moral arena for philosophical cultivation, but predetermined battlefield governed by divine decree. The War Scroll repeatedly frames the community identity in militarized and absolutist terms. In 1QM, chapter 1, verse 5 through 7, quote, "Israel, then there shall be a time of salvation for the people of God, and a time of dominion for all the men of his forces, and eternal annihilation for the forces of Belial. There shall be great panic among the sons of Japheth. Assyria shall fall with no one to come to his aid, and the supremacy of the Kittim shall cease, that wickedness be overcome without a remnant. There shall be no survivors of all the sons of darkness." End quote. The community understands itself as the sons of light, locked in unavoidable struggle against the sons of darkness, a binary opposition that structures its theology, ethics, and self understanding. This worldview leaves little room for Philo's ideals of tranquility, detachment, and rational harmony. Moreover, the scrolls are marked by sharp political polemics against identifiable enemies, both human and cosmic. The war scroll anticipates organized armed conflict involving priestly leadership, ritualized violence, and divinely sanctioned destruction. In 1QM, chapter 7, verse 9 through 10, quote, when the battle lines are arrayed against the enemy, battle line against battle line, there shall go forth from the middle opening into the gap between the battle lines 7 priests of the sons of Aaron. End quote. Rather than withdrawing from conflicts, the community interprets opposition and warfare as the very means by which righteousness is vindicated and divine justice enacted. Scripture is not allegorized into ethical instruction, but mined for a predictive and tactical meaning, reinterpreted as a record of community's present struggle and future triumph. Philo, by contrast, repeatedly stresses the Essenes' commitment to harmony and avoidance of strife. Their discipline is inwardly directed, aimed at mastery of the passions and the cultivation of peace. The war scroll refrains virtue within a militant eschatological narrative, in which righteousness is proven through participation in divinely ordered conflict and the annihilation of enemies. In 1QM, chapter 1, 9 through 10, quote, on the day when the Kittim fall, there shall be a battle and horror carnage before the God of Israel, for it is a day appointed by him from the ancient times as a battle of annihilation of the sons of darkness. End quote. History, as the scrolls present it, is not a realm for contemplative detachment, but a foreordained war zone in which the community occupies a central and active role. The contrast, therefore, is not superficial or stylistic. Philo's Essenes resemble a Jewish philosophical school oriented toward ethical perfection, rational order, and spiritual tranquility. The community reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls is defined by apocalyptic urgency, sectarian militancy, and historical self consciousness centered on imminent divine warfare. To identify these two portraits as representations of the same movement requires either a radical reinterpretation of Philo's testimony or a significant dilution of the War Scroll's own claims. Neither of which can be sustained on the basis of evidence itself. Pliny the Elder provides the briefest and least detailed reference to the Essenes among the classical sources. His notice consists primarily of a geographical observation, placing a group called the Essenes in the general vicinity of the Dead Sea. Despite its brevity, this single statement has been elevated to a position of disproportionate importance in modern scholarship, often serving as a geographical anchor that ties the Dead Sea Scrolls to Qumran and by extension to the Essenes. This elevation is methodologically unsound. Pliny's account offers no insight into Essene theology, authority, structures, textual activity, or historical self-understanding. He does not mention scrolls, libraries, or any form of scriptural production. There's no reference to sectarian documents, interpretive traditions, or existence of a corpus of writings preserved or hidden by the group. Most critically, Pliny gives no indication of a revelatory teacher figure, no hint of apocalyptic expectation, and no suggestion that the Essenes understood themselves as participants in imminent cosmic drama. In effect, Pliny provides a location without an identity. His description lacks the content necessary to establish continuity between a known literary corpus and the group he mentions. Geography alone cannot bear the exemplary weight that has been placed upon it. Many groups live near the Dead Sea, and proximity to a region does not determine authorship, ideology, or theological outlook. To, to argue otherwise is to conflate physical space with intellectual and religious identity. Moreover, Pliny's purpose as a Roman natural historian further limits the value of his testimony. For questions of sectarian authorship, his interest lies in cataloging peoples and places, not in tracing theological developments and textual traditions. The absence of details in his account is therefore not accidental but intrinsic to his genre. To treat his brief notice as confirmation of the scroll's origin requires important assumptions that Pliny himself neither states nor implies. When stripped of these assumptions, Pliny's reference contributes little more than a vague geographical marker. It does not corroborate Josephus or Philo on matters of belief, practice, or authority. Nor does it provide independent evidence that the Essenes were responsible for producing, preserving, or concealing the Dead Sea Scrolls. Using Pliny's statement to anchor an entire textual corpus to the Essenes confuses consensus of location with historical causation. The reliance on Pliny thus exposes the fragility of the Essene hypothesis as a geographical core without content level alignment from Josephus and Philo, and without textual corroboration from Pliny. The identification rests on converging evidence. It rests not on converging evidence, but on the cumulative effect of assumption and reputation. One of the most decisive points of divergence between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes described by ancient authors lies in the community's respective understandings of membership, truth, and status of outsiders. The scrolls consistently portrays a community defined by sharp boundaries and absolute claims. They present themselves as exclusive possessors of divine truth, uniquely chosen to understand the correct interpretation of the law and unfolding of history. Within the sectarian text, covenantal status is not broadly shared but narrowly restricted. Membership in the community is understood as a result of predetermined election, separating insiders from outsiders in a manner that is both theological and eschatological. Those outside the community are not merely less observant or less informed, they are portrayed as fundamentally opposed to God's purpose. The language of the scrolls regularly frames non members as participants in error, description of darkness, destined for judgment rather than restoration. This posture stands in clear contrast with the scenes described by Josephus and Philo. Both authors present the Essenes as a respected and visible movement within Judaism, known and admired even by those who did not belong to them. Their reputation rests on ethical discipline, communal generosity, and exemplary conduct, not on claims of exclusive access to divine truth or secret revelation. While the Essenes maintains distinctive practices and rigorous standards, there is no indication that they viewed the rest of Israel or humanity at large as irrevocably aligned with evil or condemned to destruction. Moreover, Josephus and Philo describe Essene accessibility in social terms. The movement is portrayed as open to newcomers willing to adopt its way of life, with initiation processes aimed at moral formation rather than at enforcing an ontological division between the elect and the damned. The Essenes are depicted as living models of virtue within Jewish society, not as embattled remnants standing against it. The tone of the Dead Sea Scrolls reflects a fundamentally different orientation. Their language is polemical, exclu- exclusionary, and absolutist. The community understands itself not as one virtuous group among many, but as a soulful, faithful remnant in an age of corruption. This self understanding permits the jeez. This self understanding permits the text shaping their theology, ethics, and interpretation of history. Righteousness is defined not simply by conduct, but by alignment with the community's revealed interpretation and authority. These contrasting social postures cannot be easily reconciled. A movement that sees itself as the only bearer of divine truth and views outsiders as children of darkness does not correspond to a group praised by contemporary observers for its exemplary ethics and social respectability. The difference is not one of internal rigor versus external perception. It is the difference in how the community understands its relationship to the wider world. In this respect, the Dead Sea Scrolls describe a sectarian identity fundamentally unlike that of the Essenes known to Josephus and Philo. Apocalyptic expectation is not a secondary or descriptive element within the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is essential to the community's understanding of itself, its mission, and its place within history. The sectarian texts consistently present the community as living in the final generation before decisive divine intervention. Time itself is interpreted as compressed and purposeful, moving inexhaustibly toward an imminent climax in which God will vindicate the righteous and judge the wicked. Within this framework, history is not viewed as a natural sequence of events, but as a script written in advance and disclosed through revelation. Scripture is treated as a coded prophetic record whose true meaning is unveiled only to the community through inspired interpretation. Contemporary events, political conflicts, and internal opposition are read as fulfillments of ancient prophecies, confirming the community's conviction that it stands at the threshold of the end. This apocalyptic worldview shapes every dimension of the scrolls. Ethical behavior is grounded not merely in obedience to the law, but in preparation for the coming judgment. Communal discipline functions as readiness for an approaching cosmic conflict. Identity itself is eschatological. The community exists because the end is near, and it presents faithfulness determines. Ugh, try that again. And it presents faithfulness determines its role. That doesn't sound right. And its present faithfulness determines its role in the coming of divine intervention. Josephus' description of the scenes, by contrast, does not operate within such an apocalyptic framework. His attention is directed towards ethical cosmic in ethics, customs, in institution procedures, and patterns of daily life. The Essenes are portrayed as cultivating virtue and stabilizing within the existing order, not as interpreting their historical movement as the final stage of cosmic history. Josephus does not describe them as decoding scripture to identify contemporary enemies or to chart an imminent eschatological timetable. The absence of apocalyptic urgency in Josephus' account is not a matter of omission of detail, it reflects a fundamentally different way of understanding reality. A community organized around the expectation of imminent divine warfare and final judgment would structure its life, teaching, and identity around that expectation. Such a worldview would be difficult to miss, especially for an author attentive to the defining characteristics of Jewish sects. The divergence, therefore, is not minor. It is the difference between a moderate and intense eschatological. I do not like this word. Eschatological. Eschatology. Yeah. Or between symbolic or literal expectation. It is the difference between philosophical movement focused on ethical formation within history and a sectarian community defined by conviction that history itself is about to end. If the Dead Sea Scrolls accurately reflect a movement whose identity is inseparable from apocalyptic expectation, then that movement cannot be equated with the Essenes as Josephus describes them without dissolving the distinctiveness of one or the other. At the heart of the Dead Sea Scrolls lies a distinctive theory of authority. The scrolls do not present the law of Moses as self-interpreting or as transmitted primarily through inherited tradition. Instead, they assert that the correct understanding of the law is mediated through revealed insight granted to a specific individual, the teacher of righteousness, and subsequently to the community's authorized leadership. Interpretation is not a matter of communal consensus or revealed customs, it is a function of divine disclosure. Within this framework, authority flows vertically from revelation rather than horizontally through tradition. The community's legal rulings, logical calculations, and interpretations of Scripture are presented as the result of insight hidden from the wider Jewish world and unveiled only to the chosen few. Obedience to the law is inseparable from allegiance to the community's interpretive authority. To reject the community's interpretation is not merely to err, but to oppose God's revealed will. This conception of the author's place this conception of authority places the Scrolls community in direct opposition to the existing religious establishment. The sectarian texts repeatedly portray the Jerusalem priesthood as corrupt, misguided, or illegitimate, accusing it of misinterpreting the law and defiling the covenant. The temple, while central to Israel's identity, is treated as compromise in its present form, and its leaders as advisories rather than custodians of divine truth. Josephus and Philo describe the Essenes as markedly different terms, while both acknowledge that the Essenes observe the law with exceptional let's try that again. While both acknowledge that the Essenes observe the law with exceptional rigor, they do not portray them as inventors claiming access to hidden revelation that overturns established authority. The Essenes are presented as traditionalists whose devotion is expressed through strict observance, communal discipline, and ethical conduct. Their authority appears to rest on shared practice and moral formation rather than prophetic insight or exclusive interpretive claims. Crucially, neither Josephus nor Philo depict the Essenes as positioning themselves in active theological opposition to the temple established to the opposed. Let's try that again. Crucially, neither Josephus nor Philo depict the Essenes as positioning themselves in active theological opposition to the temple establishment. There's no indication that they regarded the priesthood as illegitimate or that they claimed divine sanction to replace or supersede existing religious authorities. Their separation, where it exists, is described in practical or ethical terms, not as the result of a revealed indictment against Jerusalem. The difference between these two models of authority is found fundamental. A community governed by revealed interpretation and defined by opposition to establish priestly leadership cannot be equated with a movement characterized by traditional observance and ethical rigor within Judaism. The scrolls articulate the scrolls articulate a vision of law and authority rooted in revelation and conflict. Trying to see how long this chapter goes. My voice is going. The Essenes of the classical sources reflect community, discipline, and lawful piety. There are not alternative expressions of the same structure, but incompatible ways of organizing religious life. Within the initial claims of the Dead Sea Scrolls are placed alongside the external descriptions of the Essenes provided by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny, a consistent pattern of contradiction emerges. These contradictions do not appear at the margins of belief or practice, nor can they be dismissed as variations within a broader shared tradition. They occur at precisely those points that define communal identity, authority, and worldview. At the center of the scrolls stands a singular revelatory authority, the teacher of righteousness, whose insights govern interpretation of the law, understanding of history, and definition of covenantal faithfulness. No such figure appears in the classical descriptions of the Essenes. The absence is not accidental or peripheral, it removes the very axis around which the scroll's community turns. The scrolls are further defined by an apocalyptic vision of reality. History is interpreted as an imminent battlefield, moving rapidly toward divinely ordained conflict and judgment. By contrast, the Essenes of Josephus and Philo are characterized as ethical philosophers whose concerns center on discipline, virtue, and communal order within the present age. The difference is not between intense and moderate eschatology, but between apocalyptic expectation and philosophical stability. Social posture also reveals a sharp divide. The Dead Sea Scrolls articulate a sectarian exclusivism, sectarian exclusivism. That's a hard word to say. In which the community alone possesses divine truth and outsiders and casts as participants in darkness and error. Classical sources, however, describe the Essenes as widely respected for their piety and moral example, admired even by those who did not join them. There is no indication that they viewed the rest of Israel or humanity as irredeemably opposed to God. These contrasts extend into matters of law, authority. These contrasts extend into matters of law and authority. The scrolls assert that correct interpretation of law depends on revealed insight that delegitimizes existing priestly leadership. The Essenes of Josephus and Philo are portrayed as rigorous observers of the law without claims of prophetic intervention or hidden revelation that overturns traditional authority. Hostility towards the I'm reading past the punctuation here. Where are we? Yeah, we'll start here. Hostility towards the temple establishment is central in the scrolls. It is absent from the classical Essene profile. Finally, the function of the scripture itself differs fundamentally between the two portraits. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, scripture is treated as encoded prophecy deciphered to reveal the community's present conflicts and feature vindication. In the Essene description of ancient authors, scripture serves as a source of moral instruction and philosophical reflection, guiding ethical life rather than predicting historical outcomes. Taken together, these con- taken together these contrasts from good grief. Taken together, these contrasts forms of cumulative case. Oh man, I'm dying. They are not differences of emphasis that can be harmonized through nuance or hypothetical. There we go. Let's try that again. They are not differences of emphasis that can be harmonized through nuance or hypothetical diversity. They are differences of identity. To maintain the Essene hypothesis is to, in the face of such contradictions, requires redefining either the scrolls or the Essenes beyond recognition. When elevated at the level of content, authority, and worldview, the identification of the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Essenes does not clarify the evidence, it obscures it. Does this ever end? Okay, we're almost done. Like I said, this book is very repetitive, and it kind of annoys me a little bit, but it is what it is. It's just the way it had to come together because it was just a mess putting this book together. I apologize to anybody who's reading it. I get annoyed reading it myself. So anyway, we'll continue. The claims of the Dead Sea Scrolls reflects the beliefs and practices of the Essenes described by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny does not withstand sustained content level analysis. When the scrolls are examined on their own terms and compared directly with the defining features of the Essenes as portrayed by ancient observers, the identification collapses. The scrolls describe a movement structured around revelation, persecution, apocalyptic expectation, and exclusive authority. Features that are not merely underemphasized but entirely absent from the classical descriptions of the Essenes. This failure of correspondence is not the result of fragmentary evidence or incomplete sources. Josephus and Philo provide extensive and deliberate accounts of the Essene life, beliefs, and philosophical posture. Pliny, while brief, offers geographical context without theological corroboration. Together, these sources establish a coherent profile of the Essenes as an ethical and philosophical Jewish movement characterized by discipline, communal piety, and lawful observance. None of them describe a community defined by a persecuted revelatory teacher and imminent cosmic war, or a self-conception as a soulful, faithful remnant standing against a corrupt religious order. The continued survival of the Essene hypothesis, therefore, depends on methodological strategies rather than evidential strengths. Distinctions are flattened to create artificial continuity. Silence is reinterpreted as implicit agreement, and generic similarities are elevated above decisive contradictions. Where alignment fails, hypothetical explanations lost traditions, internal subgroups, or selective reporting are invoked to preserve the identification. In this way, a tentative proposal has hardened into an assumption insulated from rigorous scrutiny. When the Dead Sea Scrolls are allowed to speak on their own terms, they do not describe the Essenes of antiquity as known from classical sources. They describe a fundamentally different community, one whose identity cannot be derived from geography alone, or sustained by vague parallels in lifestyle. The scrolls articulate a distinctive theological vision, a particular structure of authority and a specific understanding of history that demands explanation in their own right. Recognizing this mismatch is not peripheral correction, it is a necessary step in dismantling the assumption that the Dead Sea Scrolls naturally and inevitably belong to the Essenes. Only once that assumption is set aside can the scrolls be examined without distortion and their true historical context, whatever it may be responsibly investigated. I hope then that's the end, and it is the end. All right.